So now it's time to look at the models in more detail, armed with that knowledge. So looking at 3 parallel strands, as I say, this is an evolution of where we are at the moment. In this model, there isn't a cognitive link between the who, the where, and the war, other than the fact they're all in the same building. So we have to link them with something. And these red phrases were the phrases I read from the Act earlier. So these are how we go about doing business. That's how we would link it in this model. So we would service our customers equally well, would service our visitors equally well in all 3 parts of the museum, but they are, in essence, 3 parallel museums: a social history museum, a natural sciences museum, and a politics and identity museum. So this is a little model of what that might be like. Here's an evolution of the existing model. Its vision might be something along the lines of 3 stories over 3 stories. So we have the who, the social and cultural history, where, natural history, and war on the top. Very, very familiar to all of you, of course, because it's an evolution of where we are at the moment. Looking at model 2, which was the twins model, this is the model that recognized the war memorial as something slightly different, and that the who and the where, the people and the place, are so interlinked. I'm going to look at 2 variants of that. Model 2A is about making a city museum. So the who and the where linked at the scale of Auckland. The environment of Auckland, the volcanoes that make the city, etc., and the people of Auckland as a city museum, which would free up the war galleries to become the de facto National War Museum that it already is, in effect. The variant 2B is to say, no, the geography of Auckland isn't constrained to the city. It's in fact Pacific-wide, and the people of the city are Pacific-wide as well, both historically and today. And that says, no, we should make a Pacific museum. And that, in turn, actually frees up the Auckland region war memorial to do exactly what it does, which is memorialize those from the Auckland region. So in both cases, it allows us to make decisions appropriate to each part. So here's a little model of the first of that. So this is meant to signify a city museum of who and where, so the interlink of people and place, with a de facto national war museum above it. And the second version of that is Pacific Stories in Science, so it's a Pacific museum and a Auckland region museum above it. So essentially, it's presented as 2 experiences: a Pacific museum as an exploration of place, and a war museum as an exploration of humanity, identity, and character. So, model 3, which was the grand unifying theory, and again, 2 variants of this. The first of those, if we remember back to what we said about the Met, was a taxonomy. So that's who plus where plus war, and that could be effectively like an encyclopedic museum. That model, a treasure chest of tales and tonga, or a cabinet of curiosities, basically a miscellany of collections celebrated for their own value. The 3B is a grand narrative, a single narrative that runs across the entire museum. And here's an example of one of those stories. It could be, for example, called Arrivals. The arrival of people, the arrival of species, and the arrival of conflict. So finally, a little look at what those models might be like. So this is seeing a treasure chest of tales and tonga as a collection-led. It would be quite an eccentric museum. This is the museum in which elephants belong right next to butterflies and belong right next to violins. Structure may be loose and flexible, allowing contemporary research or collection-led stories to fit somehow. 3B is that grand narrative, just like the Holocaust Museum. So a single narrative with 3 branches, and that would be a strongly narrative museum linking who, where, and more. And again, that example is arrivals, the arrival of people, the arrival of species, and the arrival of conflict. So the final model we're going to look at is what I call the Book of 3 Chapters. And I think of this as like a travel guide. If you travel overseas, you might go to Sydney, you might buy the rough guide to Sydney or the blue guide to Sydney. And in that, you'll find the chapters that paint a portrait of that place. So there'll be a chapter on architecture, a chapter on culture, a chapter on the history. And each of those chapters builds up your picture of that place. So the way to think about these models, these 2 variants, as being a portrait of, in this case, Auckland, in this case, New Zealand. And it could be there's another model which is Pacific. But the purpose is to say that each of our three main stories, the who, the where, the war, would be centered around the same scale. So centered on Auckland or centered on New Zealand. And the link between them is that idea of a kind of building portrait. So as you visit more of the museum, you build more of a knowledge of the city or more of a knowledge of the country. So here is a little study of what that might be. So 4A is a guidebook to Auckland. Auckland's people, Auckland's world, Auckland in the world. Each floor playing to its strengths with a loose linkage. And 4B is a guidebook to New Zealand that says we're telling the story of New Zealand's people, New Zealand's war, New Zealand in the world, and each floor, again, playing to its own strengths. So those are the four models and the variants of them. And that's the meat of all of this, except that in your feedback, there might be another model, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, however, that you want to feedback to us that you feel is more appropriate still. And the forms you'll get at the end of the evening would allow you to do so. So now we get to the real meat of it, which is, what do you think? And at this point, I hand back to Sir Don briefly. Thank you.